Thumbs up yet, Brandon? Hello, hello? Okay, there we go. Dolly? Hello, Dolly? No, thank you. Oh, my timer went off. Oh, no, there it goes. Okay, we're going to start with chapter 12, start in verse 4. But before we go, were there any particular questions from the first three verses? Okay, so let's go ahead and open up to Genesis chapter 12. And I'll start in verse 4. It says, "So Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took Sarai his wife and Lot his nephew and all their possessions which they had accumulated and the persons which they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land as far as the side of Shechem to the oak of Moreh. Now the Canaanite was then in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, 'To your descendants I will give this land.' So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Then he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai in the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. Abram journeyed on, continuing toward the Negev." Hopefully you've read chapters 12, 13, and 14 in the past week here. I want you to see that 12 and 13 are really like a travel log, and it's intentional. You'll see that we start out in Shechem, Oaks and Moreh. He goes to Bethel, then he goes to Negev, and then he goes down to Egypt in verse 10. And then we're going to see in chapter 13, he comes up from Egypt, he goes to Negev, goes to Bethel, goes to Hebron, Oaks and Mamre, 13, 18. And so he just goes down, and he just mirrors it back up when it comes to the end of chapter 13. This is intentional on Moses' part because he wants us to realize that as he goes down into Egypt, certain things happen, and then he comes back out of Egypt, and he basically sort of undoes what he had done there. The second thing I want you to realize about the whole Abraham narrative from 12 through 25 is that it is intentional with what's included and what's excluded. The way you have it right here is that you have Abram 75 years with his father, 25 years no son or father, 75 years with his son. So the stories that we have in here are not meant to be a biography of Abraham. It's not meant to pick the most important events in Abraham's life. Rather, the stories that we have included here are meant to teach us something about God and then also about Abraham, good or bad. So you want to remember that. That's why some stories may seem a little strange. Sometimes it may just be repetitive. Sometimes we wish had more information. But it's not about giving a biography of Abraham. It's just meant to teach us about God and how God is going to fulfill his promises to Abraham, which are found in verses 1 through 3. Sorry, I keep seeing something out of the corner of my eye here. All right. What I want you to notice, first of all, in verses 4 and 5, is that Lot is still with Abram. So in verse 4, it says, "And Lot went with him." And in verse 5, it says, "Lot and his nephew and all their possessions which they had accumulated, persons which they had acquired in Haran." So twice Moses emphasizes that Lot is still with him. This is in distinction from verse 1, where Abram was supposed to separate himself from his family. By the time we get through the end of chapter 13, we're going to see that Lot has now separated himself from Abram, and the only other times that we'll see Lot is purely as a foil for Abraham. That Lot is in trouble, and Abraham is going to do various things to rescue him. Because the promises given to Abraham were contingent upon him separating himself from his family. And when he goes into the promised land, he still has Lot with him, which isn't the way God intended it. So the next few chapters, we're going to see Lot weeded out, separated out from Abram, so that God can focus on Abram and him solely. I also want you to notice that in this initial part here, that Abram goes around building altars, and it talks about making tents next to those altars, and he calls upon the name of the Lord. There are a number of reasons why Abram built altars. So he built those altars and he came into the promised land. When you look at a map of the promised land, you'll see that he builds altars to the north, west, east, and he walks down to Negev to the south. And so it's basically him taking possession of the whole promised land, and he puts these altars up. These altars we'll see come back into play in chapter 13, and then Jacob's life, he'll visit those same altars. What is interesting is think about why he only had tents next to them. Why Moses goes out of his way to say, and he put up tents next to those altars. The reason I think is best, at least to me at the moment here, is that Abraham was a very rich man, but when he died, the only witness to his presence in the promised land were those altars that he built to worship God. Whereas when other rich men would die, they would have large edifices, towers, statues, homes, gardens, something to show that they had been there. But Abraham was a changed person, and he didn't need any of those things for himself. All he wanted were places to worship God and acknowledge that God had given him this land. So Moses gives us introduction to Abraham. He's come to the promised land. He's now taken possession of the promised land. And in verse 10, it all flips. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. I want you to notice that Abraham does not talk to God, does not consult God, doesn't get any word from God. What you see intentionally so is that as soon as there's a problem, Abraham leaves. And that is the thread that ties all the stories of Abraham together, is that we're going to see that an issue is going to arise, and it's going to threaten the promises of God. This is right here. Either it's going to be the promise for the seed, or it's going to be the promise for the land. And when something comes up, Abraham acts or reacts sometimes the right way, sometimes the wrong way. But regardless of how he acts, God continues to show that he will fulfill his promises, and he will take care of Abraham, and by default, or by implication, his descendants, all the way down to Jesus, bringing forth the seed that was promised. And so each one of these accounts that we have about Abraham, you can see in the light of, well, how is this going to fulfill the promise? How is this going to affect the promise? So in verse 10, we have a famine. And so, well, we can't have the land because the land won't be able to produce any food. And then consequently, we won't be able to have the seed because we're going to die out because there's a famine. People died out in famines all the time in the ancient world, more so than today. He says in verse 11, it came about when he came near to Egypt that he said to Sarai his wife, see now, I know that you are a beautiful woman, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say that you're my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, that I may live on account of you. It came about when Abram came into Egypt, the Egyptians saw the woman was very beautiful. Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And therefore he treated Abram well for her sake, and gave him sheep and oxen and donkeys and male and female servants and the female donkeys and camels. But the Lord struck Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Then Pharaoh called to Abram and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife, take her and go. Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they escorted him away with his wife and all that belonged to him. You want to notice that in verse 10 it talked about he went down there to sojourn. Sojourn is a long-term plan as it's used in the Bible. I can only think of one possible exception for the word being used. Most times it was used when somebody's going to go to a place for months, if not years. So Abram is going down to Egypt for the long haul, which is why he said, now I'm going to live in Egypt, and you're a beautiful woman. I need you to protect me by saying, you are my sister. A couple things here. The fear that Abraham felt was very real. We could just look a few books ahead with David and Bathsheba and Uriah, where a king saw a woman, took her husband, and then killed him. Of course, David was a godly man, so he did it in a roundabout way, put him in the forefront of a war, ensuring that he would die. But still, kings abuse their power all the time. So it wasn't like it was unlikely to happen. It was likely to happen. Kings just like to do what they like to do. The second thing is that you want to remember that while Sarai was 65, she still had another 60 years that she was going to live. So from our point of view, that puts her in her 30s or 40s. So plenty of ladies are physically attractive in their 30s and 40s and 50s. So that could be what he's saying there. More likely, however, what he is saying is that she doesn't have physical beauty, but she has attraction for other reasons. You want to remember that it's only been in recent times that our beauty standard has gone back to a very young-looking person. In times past, it wasn't that way. If we look back to a writing that's near the time of the Pentateuch with Homer, the blind poet, he wrote about Odysseus and his wife. And his wife was in her 50s, and she had tons of suitors that wanted to marry her because she was so beautiful, because she had power, she had intelligence, she had authority, she had wealth, she had all these things going for her. So the reasons that Abram decided to marry Sarai are reasons that Abram thinks Pharaoh is going to take Sarai from her. Now the question I want you to think about is, if you were an Israelite hearing this story, Moses is giving you this story, what would jump out to you? Well, one of the things that would jump out to you is the fact that when we came out of Egyptian bondage, we were not the first ones to go down to Egypt and have bad things to happen to us. Our forefather, Abraham, went down to Egypt because of famine. And you'll see that people go down to Egypt a number of times in the book of Genesis because of famines. You will also notice that Pharaoh had plagues that fell upon his household. They had experienced that same thing. And so they would make a connection between their experiences and Abraham's experiences, which means they're going to make the connection between God telling them to get out of Egypt and go back to the promised land, because that's where you need to be. Did you notice in verse 6, where it says, Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem to the oaks of Moreh. Now the Canaanite was then in the land. Whenever the final version of the Pentateuch was put together, Canaanites are no longer in the land, the promised land. So they had to put this note in there because it had been centuries since the Canaanites were in that land, to remind the people that the Canaanites were in the promised land at that time. And when God calls Abraham, he calls him to the promised land, and he doesn't say, I want you to kick out all the Canaanites, or I want you to kill all the Canaanites, or I want you to convert all the Canaanites. He says, I just want you to live here, and I'll take care of you. That's an important lesson for the Israelites sometimes, that they need to realize that God is going to use them, and when he wants to accomplish something different, he'll tell them different. When he wants them to kill the Canaanites, he says, I want you to do this. When he says, I want you to make peace with these people, this is what he wants you to do. When I want you to fight a war, I'll tell you to go fight a war. As you read the Old Testament, you'll see that a lot of the troubles that came upon the nation of Israel were solely because whatever king was in charge decided we need to go fight this country over here or these individuals over here. And almost invariably, it always turned out bad. But whenever they talked with God, and God took care of things, they hardly had to do anything. And God wiped out armies left and right. because God was going to take care of them. God was going to be with them. That's the lesson the Israelites needed to understand before they went into the promised land, that God was with Abraham, and he is going to be with you. So have faith when you go into the promised land. But of course, when we read Joshua and Judges, we know they didn't really have that level of faith. Yes, sir?
Do we know this mountain between Bethel and Ai by any other name? Is it possible that is the mountain that Jerusalem ended up on?
Oh, no. I don't. Let me rephrase that. It's very challenging for us to try to tie together the names and locations with what we know from later biblical passages and what we know from modern times, because they just sort of change. So even his description of, in verse 8, like you were saying, they proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent for Bethel on the west and Ai in the east. Bethel didn't get that name till the lifetime of Jacob, because Jacob's the one that named it Bethel. And Ai didn't get its name till the time of Joshua, because Ai means ruin, and Joshua sacked the city. So there must be some mountain, or whether they thought it was some mountain there, but we're not really sure what the mountain is, because they didn't have the same concern for accuracy that we do today here. We have things that are really tight on our borders and our geographical locations, but they just reference things a lot more fluid, I guess I would say here. So the short answer is no. Long answer, I've already given. See, so I was talking about, right, and another thing that would have struck the Israelites was the fact that we had a woman going to be saved, men were going to be endangered, which is exactly what happened with the time of Moses. Women were saved. If you were a female child, if you were a male child, Pharaoh wanted to get rid of you, kill you, so forth and so on. I want you to, as you read Genesis, compare the account of Pharaoh and Abraham and Sarah with the account of Abimelech, Abraham and Sarah, because they're parallel accounts, and Abram yet again lies about Sarah being his wife's sister, and Abimelech has a different outcome from what Pharaoh has. That being said, the reason is, while it's not 100% clear, the reason is most likely is because Pharaoh chose to sleep with Sarai. So when you look at verse 15, Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh. One was taken to Pharaoh's house. And then in verse 17, the Lord struck Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Then Pharaoh called to Abram and said, What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife, take her and go. So there's a good chance that Pharaoh did inappropriate things with Sarai, which is why he had all those plagues come down upon him. Abimelech, however, did not do inappropriate things, and he had ability to avoid those plagues. It's a bit ironic that God had told Abram that he was going to be a blessing to people, but when he comes into Egypt, he's a curse to people because he lied. So then Pharaoh loads him up with all his wealth and tells him to get out of here, and he uses the same word that God had said. So you notice that Pharaoh says, take her and go in verse 19, which is exactly the same thing what God said, go forth in verse 1. It's almost like God is saying, I need you to get out of Egypt, go back to the promised land, and I will take care of you. So when we get to chapter 13, we do see an Abram that is different than what was found in chapter 12. It says, in verse 1, so Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, he and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot was with him. Now Abram was very rich in livestock and in silver and gold. He went on his journey from the Negev as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there formerly, and there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, and land could not sustain them while dwelling together, for their possessions were so great they were not able to remain together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now the Canaanites and Perizzites were dwelling then in the land. So Abram said to Lot, "Please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, then I will go to the right, or if to the right, then I will go to the left." Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go to Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated themselves from each other. So let's stop there. Many times when we teach a Bible class to little kids, and we come to this section, the lesson we try to emphasize is about sharing. It's like, well, you need to learn to share, like Abraham did. He didn't want to fight with Lot. He's like, if you want this toy, then I'll take this toy. If you want this toy, then I'll take that toy. And we just need to get along better with our brothers, our siblings, our cousins, or whatever, and share. But that's not the point God is making here at all. It's not about sharing. Even though that is a biblical concept, that's not what he's teaching here. What he's trying to teach us here is that Lot is the problem, and Lot needs to go away. Not that he's a sinful problem, it's just that he's not what God wanted him to do. Lot needs to separate himself from Abram so God can start fulfilling his promises to Abraham. Which is why Abram says, you take this land or this land, you go wherever you want, and I'll go someplace else. So I do want you to see the level of faith that Abraham now has in God. He's not concerned about where he's going to live, because he knows that wherever he lives, God will take care of him, God will bless him, and if Lot takes the best land in the world and leaves me the hill country, like Caleb had, that's okay, because God will bless me, and I will become enriched because of it, and I'll be a blessing to other people. So in chapter 13, we have a diametrically opposed Abraham from chapter 12. One didn't trust God, trusted himself, went down to Egypt. Now he trusts in God, which is why he goes back to his altars and worships the Lord and renews his relationship, and again goes back into the promised land and revisits all those sites. We should notice I'm not seeing the word east. What verse was that? Well, I'll have to think about that for a second here. We should notice that again, verse 7, you had the note, now the Canaanites and Perizzites were joined, then in the land, and then, of course, the note about Sodom and Gomorrah not yet being destroyed. Verse 13, now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord. So verse 14, the Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had separated him, now lift up your eyes and look from the place where they are, northward and southward, eastward and westward. For all land which you see, I will give to you and to your descendants forever. I'll make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. Arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you. Then Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Moses does want you to see a contrast between when Lot lifted up his eyes and looked versus when Abram lifted up his eyes and looked. Yes, sir? Yes, that is the verse. Eastward, that's right, yeah. I don't know why my eye can't see it sometimes. So, thanks, that's exactly what I want. You should have gotten the habit of noticing east is, at least in Genesis, moving away from God. And that's a little bit of foretelling, that's not the right word, foreshadowing. Foreshadowing that Lot has made a bad decision. What I find interesting about Lot is that when he came from Haran, he had a little bit of wealth. When they came to the promised land, he got more wealth. When they went down to Egypt, they got even more wealth. When they come back to the promised land, he has a lot of wealth, so much so that his shepherds are fighting with Abram's shepherds, so there's just too much wealth between them, and he decides he needs to leave. But he doesn't seem to realize, or doesn't seem to remember, that the only reason he has the blessings that he has is because of his relationship with Abram. The fact that he stood next to Abram, God just automatically blessed him and did things for him, because that's the way God operates a lot of times. And when he chooses to leave Abram, he's leaving the path of blessings. Because remember, the promise was that Abraham was going to be able to bless others and be a blessing to others. And then ultimately, his seed, Jesus Christ, will be able to bless all the world. So already Moses is trying to get us to understand that Lot is making a poor decision. Okay, any particular questions on chapter 13? He did. He would end up with much less because of what he'd done. Other questions? All righty. Then let's go to chapter 14 here. It says in verse 1, it came about in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, so-and-so, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goim, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemember, king of Zeboim, and king of Bela, that is Zoar. And all these came as allies to the valleys of Sidon, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer, but the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came to defeat the Rephaim in Ashtaroth, Karanim, and the Zuzim, and Ham, and Emen, and so-and-so. And the Horites in the Mount Seir as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En-Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and conquered all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites who lived in Hezazon Tamar. And the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah and the king of Admah and the kings of Zoibin and the king of Bela, that is Zor, came out and they arrayed for battle against the kings of Sidon, against Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and the king of Goim, and the king of Shinar, and the king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Sidon was full of tar pits, and the king of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and they fell into them, hid in them. But those who survived fled to the hill country. Then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food supplies and departed. They also took Lot, Abram's nephew, and his possessions and departed, for he was living in Sodom. Then a fugitive came and told Abram the Hebrew. Now he was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and these were allies with Abram. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men, born in his house, 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them as far as Hobath, which is north of Damascus. He brought back all the goods and also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions and also the women and the people. Okay, so we'll stop there for a second. It's an interesting story because we have all these kings battling in that valley near the promised land, and the only reason we have it recorded is because they took Lot. And so Abraham goes back, defeats them, captures Lot, and returns back home. What Moses wants you to get from this is not how ancient kings fought, or not how they fled, but if Abram is able to defeat those who were defeat the guys who won the battle, then that makes Abram greater than those kings there. And those kings had possession of the promised land, which means that Abram would have possession of the promised land, which is what we're going to see with Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek is greater than Abram, and as a consequence, Abram gives something to Melchizedek. Melchizedek gives him a blessing. So the story is recorded just for us to get an idea that at least in that time period, legally speaking, Abram would have had some claim to the promised land because he is now the most powerful one in that whole area. I do find it interesting that it points out he took 318 men that were born in his household, which means they had to have at least 1,000 people in his household to sustain that, which of course makes me wonder when he left his home way back when, how many people did he actually leave behind? It doesn't sound like he left everybody behind. He took a bunch, and then of course he got more in Haran, and they got more in Egypt. He just had collected all these people, and his household is getting larger and larger and larger. His wealth is accumulating more and more and more because God is just blessing him and taking care of him. So that's what I think Moses wants you to get from this story, is that Abraham is now greater than all those kings who have possession of the promised land. Therefore, he can take possession of the promised land, which means his children, 400 years later, can take possession of it because God will do that. Now we come to the really interesting part of the story. Then after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shevav, that is, the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was the priest of the God Most High. He blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of the God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. He, that is Abram, gave him a tenth of all. The king of Sodom said to Abram, Give the people to me and take the goods for yourself. Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have sworn to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal thong or anything that is yours for fear you would say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing except what the young men have eaten and the share of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their share. So Sodom lost, and when Abram comes back with all the wealth from the kings who defeated Sodom, Sodom says, let me have this and you can keep this. And Abram says, I don't want anything of yours because I don't want you to say ever in the future that you're the one who made Abraham rich. My allies, they can take what they think belongs to them, but all I'm going to take is what belongs to me and the food my men already ate. Everything else can go back to you because I want nothing to do with you. The king of Salem, which is the old name for Jerusalem, he's the priest of God Most High. That is the one true God, which Abraham emphasizes when he uses the same verbiage to describe God. The God I worship is the God that Melchizedek is the high priest to. He comes out to him and has this offering of bread and wine. Abraham accepts it and then gives a tenth to him. What we want to understand from the New Testament is that whoever you give an offering to, you give to the greater one, and that makes you the lesser one. Abraham gives to Melchizedek. That makes Melchizedek, in the grand scheme of things, more important than Abram. This becomes significant because it's only the tribe of Levi that are allowed to be present before God in his tabernacle and his temple. Jesus, as Hebrews makes clear, is not from the tribe of Levi. So how can he become a priest? How can he become a high priest? And the point is made that he becomes a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, which is something that was greater than the Judaic tribes. And so Jesus can become a priest in this form or fashion, which makes him greater than the Abrahamic priest, the Mosaic priesthood, because he is the one that's greater. Questions? Yes, sir? Right, and that's the point Paul makes in Hebrews, is that Melchizedek doesn't have a mother or father. He just sort of comes on the scene. So we've read enough of Genesis that we've seen genealogies left and right. Good guys have genealogies. Bad guys have genealogies. We have genealogies of people that we don't really care about, genealogies of people that we do care about. Melchizedek just walks in the scene after the battle, says, here's an offering of bread and wine, and Abraham gives him the tenth of the spoils, and then that's it. And then you have to go to the Psalms before you get another reference to Melchizedek by inspiration foretelling what's going to happen to him. So at least as far as Genesis is concerned, he just shows up for one scene and leaves. Realistically, his city would have had people that worship God. Realistically, there might have been other priests. And you want to remember this, that the Bible, specifically the Old Testament, is concerned about the promises and how those are being fulfilled. It's not concerned with describing all the people in the world that believe in God. Because there are plenty of people that believe in God that are not described in the Bible. That's not what the Bible is about. Even the people in the Bible sometimes think that they're the last faithful person before God. And God's like, no, I have people reserved all these other places who believe in me, who worship me, who have faith in me. You are not alone. Which is a good lesson for the church to realize, because sometimes when you're surrounded by people at work and at school and even in your own homes who are godless, who are against God, sometimes it feels like you're just a lone candle out there. But God wants us to remember that there are always people across this whole globe who are faithful to Him. I remember reading a missionary book back in the 70s. It was written back in the 70s, not when I was reading it in the 70s. And the missionary was flying to the Middle East, and he was talking to a guy, and he's talking about the church or whatever, and the native there said, well, you know, that sounds like this group of people over here in Iran. And he come to find out that these people believed in God, believed in Jesus, followed the Bible, did baptism by immersion, did all the things that we would do. We just never knew they existed, because sometimes I hate to say this, but we're just arrogant. We really think we're the only one. I am the last good man. Norman is the last perfect husband. After that, it's just all downhill. But that's not the case. God is always raising up people to be faithful to Him. God is always raising up people that will glorify Him. And if we keep that in mind, then when we encounter people, we shouldn't be surprised when they want to respond to the truth. Because we were like that. They can be like that, because there are people who are searching, who want to have a relationship with God, with Jesus. We need to have that attitude. No matter where we are, we can find them, because God will put them in our path. That's why the whole ask, seek, knock, and you will find. Okay, so one last point that I want you to see here about this section right here. Over in Matthew 6, 15 through 34, we have Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount, and we have a number of good points and bad points that are described. Sometimes Jesus talks about people who worry about today and who can't get past the worry. And they're concerned about their life, they're concerned about this, but they have no power to change anything, but they're still worried about things. He culminates it at the end by saying that this is what I want you to do. I want you to seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. And those are the things that God says the Gentiles need: food, clothing, and shelter. So I want you to consider Abraham's life in light of that. You can see up here that he is concerned about himself. He is worried about what's going to happen tomorrow. He is worried about what's going to happen to his wife. He's worried about what's going to happen to himself. He's worried about all kinds of things. And, of course, nothing really good happens to him. When you get to him coming back in the promised land, here, he just has a great deal of confidence in God, and he trusts that no matter what happens, God will take care of him, because he is now seeking first God. And then that's exactly what God does. He just takes care of Abraham, blesses him all the more. That's the lesson the Israelites needed to understand as they came out of Egyptian bondage, that God would take care of them. They just needed to seek Him first. God gave them food every day of their lives. They were wandering through the wilderness, and they complained most of those days. But God still provided for them. When they came into the promised land, they just needed to believe that God would be with them and overcome things, and they just needed to focus on God first. And when they focused on God, God did mighty things through them. Well, that's what it is with us. We have just as many worries as Abraham had. We have just as many problems going on, just as many things that can cause us to stumble. We have less reason to have lack of faith than Abraham, because at least as far as the text is concerned, God only talked to Abraham 6, 7, 8 times, and that's it. God can talk to us every day of our lives. We can read His Word and see how He's interacted for thousands of years and His faithfulness through everything. So we have even less reason to be faithless and lack of trust in God. But the choice is still ours. Are we going to seek first God's kingdom and His righteousness? If we do, God will take care of us. That's the great thing about God. No matter how hungry I've been, God has taken care of me. No matter how wet I become, because I'm outside, God's taking care of me. No matter how sick I become, God will take care of me. And if we should die, that's okay too, because God will take care of us. Because He has promised to raise us up, give us a new body. God will take care of us. We just need to trust Him, which is the ultimate goal that God wants us to get from the life of Abraham. He's the first person in the Bible that really trusts God when he has all kinds of reasons not to trust God. If He can do it, how much more can we do it? Any questions? Okay, go ahead and read 15, 16, and 17, and we will